Hi, everyone. Thanks for showing up. How many people do we have here? Some regulars. I'm here with Kat Rosenfield, who is an author and a writer and a sort of newish advice columnist over at Persuasion. Is that a good intro for you?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not new to advice columnizing, but I am new to Persuasion. I've been their advice columnist for, I guess, maybe 3 or 4 months.
Yeah. Okay. And I get I get the impression from your column, which I have been following, that it's sort of like a column to deal with people's cancel culture, woke culture issues.
It's honestly, if people want to send me like normal advice column questions, that is also totally fine. It's just, I think because of the sort of the bent of the site, and obviously Yasha Monk, who started it, is a sort of a heterodox thinker, and wanted to push back against that type of vibe in sort of other mainstream media spaces. So I think that as a result, I'm getting a lot of that kind of question. Although a couple of them have been more like, how do I talk to my parents about this guy that I want to meet from the internet? So when that comes through, it's refreshing. But yeah, so far it's been a lot of, how do I avoid political arguments? What do I do when someone wants to compel my pronouns at a wedding? That kind of thing.
Right. So, and one of the more controversial columns that you wrote recently was about that pronoun thing. Maybe I'll read, I have it pulled up here, so maybe I'll read the question for people who missed this whole thing. So this is what someone wrote to you. Just to get like right into the most controversial thing, I guess.
Why not?
Like, here we go. One of my closest friends is getting married. His fiance asked me to submit information about myself for a wedding webpage, including my preferred pronouns. I mean, I find that a bit weird. And I, of course, would be annoyed also. I'm very supportive of the right of trans people to identify as they see fit, especially when their preferred pronouns do not correspond to their biological sex. But I'm not trans, and I'm unaware of any trans people in attendance. And it is clear to anyone with decent vision that I am a cis male. I find this kind of virtue signaling irritating, so I'm tempted to just submit my biographic information without preferred pronouns. I also don't want to cause trouble. Am I a raging transphobe for feeling uneasy about all of this? What should I do? Oh, your cat showed up.
Yeah,
Just as predicted.
He's hanging out. This is Rasputin. He enjoys the internet.
He looks huge. Is he huge?
He's a pretty big boy, yeah.
Yeah. He looks like a bit of a wildcat.
An absolute unit, as the kids online say.
So how, like, first of all, how did you respond to this? Like, what was your response to this query or social challenge?
So I pointed out the idea of stating your pronouns up front is not necessarily a good idea, not just, not for, the reasons that this guy mentioned, that, he thinks it's virtue signaling and he doesn't like it for that reason. But also, even a lot of trans people don't necessarily want or need to state their preferred pronouns because they're obvious. Most people's pronouns are obvious from looking at them. I mean, it's strange to me that that's become an unpopular thing to say, or a controversial thing to say, but it's true. It is true not just for people who identify with their natal sex. It's also true for people who've transitioned. So, I pointed out that basically if you ask for a person's pronouns, you're implying that they're not obvious. Sorry, this is a little messy. And that, it can be insulting for that reason, but also that since it is their wedding and they can ask for pronouns if they want to, it's fine to have your pronoun preference just be none and just not respond. I think that, if we're trying to ask for preferred pronouns in the event that somebody wants to provide them. It should also be a valid choice not to provide them. We shouldn't, feel compelled to do this, I think, probably. I thought. It turned out that this was a controversial way to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I feel like people have asked me this kind of question before, like via the podcast or live stream, or like it's come up with my friends in their real lives, like they're working somewhere and their work wants them to put their pronouns on their email signature or something like that. And I mean, I don't totally know how to respond to people, especially when it's like within a work context, because obviously you don't want to get fired from your job or like start shit with HR or with your coworkers or whoever. But I mean, so I struggle to respond for that reason and wonder what I would do if I were in that situation, because of course I'm in a situation where I'm independent, like I work for myself, so I don't have to, like I'm luckily pretty free to say what I want to say. But I mean, yeah, I mean, I would tend to agree with you that it should be okay to just be like, I don't really want to use any pronouns. Like, why do I have to? But what was the response to you when you offered that advice?
People were pretty upset, specifically that I suggested that people's pronouns are generally easy to determine from looking at them. And I understand that there is a sort of a push in certain spaces on the left to normalize the idea that it's not, that you can never assume. I think people should be able to identify however they want, to start, compelling pronouns as like a matter of course, and to suggest that you can't figure them out, from other context clues. That is troublesome to me because I think that it represents an erosion of an important norm. We use, well, obviously we don't use pronouns ourselves, like other people use them for us. So there's this attempt to sort of prescribe the way that other people think or talk about you, which is, you're already stepping into a sort of a dangerous mire there, since, you can't actually control what other people say about you when you're not there, or how they talk about you. So there's this externalizing of your locus of control when you start getting into the whole, my pronouns are X, Y, and Z, and like you have to use them thing. But the other thing is that, being able to assume certain things about people is sort of fundamental to public trust. It's what helps keep society glued together. It's how that we are, able to walk around all day and interact with each other and not be suspicious of each other. And if you get rid of that for the sake of making a different population of people more comfortable because they don't want to be the only ones with non-obvious pronouns who are providing them all the time, I think you at least have to consider what you're sacrificing when you decide to ditch the norm that's worked for like the entirety of human history, that works still for most people, and institute this new one.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, so what would you say to somebody who was, not dealing with just sort of a social norm? So, I'm attending this wedding. They want me to announce my preferred pronouns. This is awkward. What do I do? But someone who was in a workplace kind of situation and, felt uncomfortable with it for genuine reasons. I mean, I think there's lots of genuine reasons to be uncomfortable. Like I said, I would not want to do it. I mean, we don't have to get too deeply into it, and my audience knows what my opinions about all this are, but I, disagree with the concept of cis in and of itself, and I disagree with the idea that you can identify in and out of biological sex, for example. But I would just more be annoyed, be like, I don't want to participate in this. This is stupid. Even this guy who wrote to you was like, this is just virtue signaling. What would you say to somebody who was like dealing with a workplace context? So, they feel sort of more threatened.
All right, that's enough. It's a difficult thing to say. I mean, I think the question is, can your workplace compel you to, to engage in this form of self-expression? Is that actually required? I mean, I would be tempted, you know, as long as a person's job is not at risk. And it's hard to imagine, you know, and I'm now wishing before we started talking that I'd like looked up workplace speech protections, you know, in the US to see how that would work. But, you know, if you don't want to provide your pronouns any more than, you know, you prefer not to reveal some other aspect of your identity, I really think that you should be able to simply decline to do that. Just, you know, feel like I would prefer not to. It should be a valid choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you would think so too. I suppose, I mean, I think that a lot of the problem with, I know that you write a lot about various aspects of cancel culture. You've written a lot about the kind of current culture of YA literature, which we can get into also. But I guess like one of the issues with cancel culture, and I sort of get frustrated with people because I feel like if people stopped going along with cancel culture, then cancel culture would cease to exist. You know, if we stopped supporting it or stopped supporting our friends when they do it, if everybody kind of spoke up and was like, hey, this is stupid, hey, this is dangerous, hey, this is harmful, then it would not be so powerful. But the power of cancel culture in part is that other people go along with it because they're afraid of being canceled, right? So people don't speak out in defense of the canceled, or speak out against cancel culture because they think that then they'll be the next one to be canceled. So I guess, you know, I sort of wonder, I struggle with, again, offering advice to people who will tell me privately how much they hate what's going on with all this, but don't know what to do because they don't want to get in some big fight on social media or whatever, or they don't want their friends to hate them, or they don't want to get fired.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I really hate the term cancel culture. I think it sounds silly, and I think it makes what's happening easy to dismiss. Also, I'm going to crib from another podcast. I was just listening to the fifth column on this topic, but I think it was Camille Foster mentioned that because we call it this thing, people tend to focus on individual cancellations and whether they were merited. And instead, you know, what we really should be focusing on is the culture, which, yeah, I mean, it's not just about going after people. It's about the culture of fear and the culture of mistrust. One of the things that I wrote about, you know, on the topic was that the major issue was that it erodes the, you know, the trust that allows people to function normally and healthily in society when they're constantly worried that everybody around them is like keeping an oppo file on them, you know, and trying to hang on to screenshots or receipts in case the time ever comes when they need to pull out evidence that this person was once bad or once problematic. And until people, I mean, you don't even have to have a critical mass of people doing this. You just need a few of them kind of ruining it for everyone else. And then it takes an enormous amount of courage to opt out and to say, I won't do this because the people engaged in it have basically remade the culture in the image that they want, and everyone else is terrified. And you know, the power has sort of centered on them. So it's a hard thing to undo once it starts sliding in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I think that it's interesting because it's always hard for me to judge whether things are getting worse or getting better because I feel like I'm so on the inside, and you probably feel this way too, and that you're pretty like engaged in this conversation, and you've been also engaged in challenging cancel culture. I know it's annoying to keep saying that term over and over and over again. I don't know what else to call it. I'm sick of saying virtue signaling too, but I also don't know how else to describe it. But you know, like it seems to me like more and more people are getting sick of it and sort of like verging on speaking out against it. But at the same time, like I just keep thinking like, well, how many more people can we cancel? But then, you know, it's the new year, and I think that the first person who got canceled was like Bean Dad.
Speaking of needing better terms,
I know. I didn't even see it when it all went down. I mean, I'm not on Twitter, but like somebody posted about it on Facebook, and I was like, what the fuck is Bean Dad? And then I looked it up, and I was like, oh my God, you guys, this is the stupidest, like, of all the controversies. I guess, so did you follow all this?
So I eventually broke down. I was on Twitter and I saw everyone talking about it, and I was like, what the fuck is Bean Dad? You know, so I searched for it and then immediately wished that I hadn't, because it was so dumb and bad. And just, you know, I don't even really care that much about the dad or the beans or the daughter or the can opener, you know, that are people gonna know what I'm talking about? Should I like sum this up?
Like you here, yeah, you go ahead and summarize.
Okay, Bean Dad is a man whose last name I think is Roderick.
John Roderick.
John Roderick, a podcaster, a man who at least fancies himself a comedian, wrote this long thread telling a story about how his daughter wanted to eat food and he told her to make a can of baked beans. She said, how? He said, open the can. She said, how? He realized he'd never taught her how to use the can opener. So rather than teaching her in this moment how to use the can opener, he had her figure out over the course of 6 hours, according to him, before anyone was allowed to eat anything in the house. She had to figure out herself how to use the can opener. And apparently this kid is 9 years old, and machines and tools and spatial awareness are not her strong suit. So this was really an ordeal. People found this funny at first and then obnoxious, which I guess is probably where I landed. You know, reminded me of the kind of thing that my own father might have tried to do, only dialed up like way beyond what was, you know, acceptable or necessary.
That's the same response I had too. I was like, yeah, that sounds like something my dad would have done. Maybe not over 6 hours, but I also wonder if the 6 hour thing was an exaggeration on his part to make the story more interesting.
It was. Yeah, and you know, as a result, you know, he played this up, you know, for dramatic effect to make it a better story. The upshot of this is that Bean Dad was accused of child abuse because his daughter did not get beans until 6 hours of, you know, after she had to endure a 6 hour ordeal with the can opener trying to figure out how it worked. Yeah, you know, not if I had children, I would not parent them this way. But anyway, Bean Dad, I think, like, people eventually, once he was identified as Twitter's main character of the day, everybody started trying to dig up his old tweets and get him canceled for whatever. It was like, was he ever racist? Was he ever problematic in any way? Did he ever say anything that could be construed as problematic? And of course, there's always a tweet or several tweets. And I think Bean Dad is, well, he's not dead, but, you know, but he might as well be.
Not yet.
I think he deleted his account. And I think that, so he was a podcaster and he had a podcast with Ken Jennings, who I guess was going to be the replacement host for Jeopardy. And I think that Ken Jennings may have lost the Jeopardy gig due to his association with the notorious Bean Dad.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I guess, yeah. So, I mean, I read this thread and thought all the same things that you thought, and saw everyone saying that this was like child abuse and he like starved his kid. And yeah, not only did I think, that sounds like something my dad would have done. And I think it's kind of like a jerky thing to do. It's like, why don't you just show her how to use the can opener? And to be honest, like, I have trouble figuring out how certain can openers work still as an adult now. There's some can openers and I'm like, what the fuck is this? Either they're like overly simple and I can't figure out, or they're like overly complex. Like, there's new can opener technologies and I don't understand how they work. And I don't have like a mechanical brain, so I think I struggle with these kinds of as a 40-year-old.
The part where Bean Dad realized that he'd never showed her how to use the can opener, that was when things immediately went off the rails. It's like the first thing you do is you show your kid how to use the tool. And then, if it's complicated thereafter, maybe it's like a teachable moment. But that was on him. He didn't show her how to use the can opener when she was a small child, and now he made her life miserable over it. She's probably gonna either she's gonna be in therapy for this, for years, or she'll develop like a crazy fetish where she needs to be beaten with a can opener because.
Yeah, I mean, I think that he obviously thought it was a teachable moment, and he was like, "This will be good for her brain to learn how to figure this out on her own," which is, admirable. Like, I think in some ways, I'm sure some people argued, I think I saw some people making this argument online somewhere. They argued that, this generation is so coddled. We're always talking about how the younger generations, I'm not sure how old you are, but maybe the generation younger than the millennials, let's say. I mean, the millennials are touched by this also. Okay. Yeah, I think I'm like sort of in between Gen X and the end of millennial, depending on which years you look at. Probably the very, very end of Gen X, I guess. But that they're pampered, they're coddled, they're protected, they need safe spaces, yada yada yada. So this is a good thing for a parent to be doing in this context. Make them endure some kind of hardship so that they grow up to be adults who can also handle a hardship.
I mean, I'm all for letting kids figure things out. It just, this was just not the way. I think so. I sent the thread to my mom because I was like, certain things about this remind me of Dad, just like dialed up to 11. And she said, yes, that she like the impulse to kind of hint around the solution, trying to get you to figure it out yourself when they could just say like, it's this. I think that's a very Dad thing to do, maybe. But then she also said that this man has the soul of a pedant, which I think is kind of, that's it. That's the problem. But I also think that actually, I mean, well, two things about the Bean Dad saga. One is that I think it really kind of brought home how much this is what the internet, and especially what Twitter is for, is like finding this main character and then just destroying their lives. The other thing was how much people don't want to be like, they don't want to be amused. They don't want to be entertained. This man wrote this thread thinking that he was telling a funny story. And Twitter was like, we don't want a funny story. We want blood. We want the lottery, like we just want to stone somebody to death arbitrarily in the public square for no particular reason. We're just very bored. So I think that's
I think that's a good point. And I think I heard you talking about this on a recent podcast, in the context of Nanette, which is that people are sort of, they don't want humor anymore. Like, it's as though they want everything to be overly serious all the time. And I found this a lot in terms of, I don't know, I find that there's like a lot of new movies and TV shows where the wokeness is forced to such an extent that I just want to barf. Like, I can't even watch Saturday Night Live anymore because it's not funny, because I feel like they're trying so hard just to push liberal politics or, woke ideas on the audience that it ceases to be funny.
Yeah, it's a hard line to walk. I think part of the problem is that a lot of people on the left still imagine that they're sort of cultural underdogs when that's really not the case anymore and hasn't been for a while. The left pretty much won the culture war and is now dominant, in all of these spaces. And I think, it's no longer subversive to throw in a sly little reference to some, liberal political cause. It's you know, I don't want to say punching down, because I kind of reject that framework as like a good thing for comedy in general. But yeah, you know, there is definitely a lot of painfully unfunny stuff happening right now.
Mm-hmm. And like the way that this kind of thing goes down on Twitter, it seems like people want to, or often want to, you know, intentionally miss any kind of humor or just any kind of lightness. Everything is over serious. You know, the fact that they would take this story, which is not, you know, a particularly, or shouldn't have been a particularly controversial story, and they want to turn it into abuse and ruin this man's life, I feel like is actually pretty representative of something that's going on in our culture right now.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I don't know. The only thing that's worse, or at least as bad as, you know, sort of like self-consciously progressive comedy, is the stuff that happens on the right, where it's like trigger the libs comedy, where it's just, you know,
Right.
it's basically like some guy standing on stage, like, I don't know, just yelling. I mean, basically, I feel like the past 4 years have made everybody stupider and less funny, and less able to take a joke, and it's unfortunate.
Yeah. Okay, so we do have a super chat question.
Okay, that's a super chat.
Which is Kat, what else should dads teach their daughters? Kind of a big question. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, gosh,
Like, are
like,
you just trolling, or do you seriously want an answer to that?
um, that's a
List all the things dads should teach their
every
daughters. How to use a can
literally
opener.
everything, you know. I mean, how to use a can opener first and foremost. Unless you yourself do not know how to use one, like, you shouldn't teach your kid how to do things that you don't know how to do.
Hmm.
But yeah, sorry, Rasputin is really, really trying to get in on this.
He really wants to participate.
Because he sucks. Not your moment,
At least
buddy.
he's quiet. My dog starts whining, so it just
Oh,
sounds. I'm like, why are you torturing your dog in the background, Megan?
oh, poor guy. But yeah, what should dads teach their daughters? I don't know. Reading, writing, and arithmetic. You know, any useful skills. Like, if you're Liam Neeson and Taken and you know how to do that stuff, you should probably teach your daughter that stuff too, before she's kidnapped by, you know, a group of traffickers in Europe. This is the best I can do on short
How to
notice.
hunt, how to shoot a gun,
Yeah. Again, assuming you
how to
know
fix
how
a
to shoot a
truck.
gun yourself. Gosh, my father taught me to shoot a gun. I think we'd both end up dead. Neither one of us would know what we're doing.
I don't think anybody in my family knows how to shoot a gun, but and therefore I don't know either. Okay, so the other thing that I wanted to talk to you about was this. So you wrote 2 YA young adult books. Is that correct?
I did.
Yeah. So one was 2012, one was 2014.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder what you feel, if anything, has changed in YA culture since you published those books.
So a lot has changed. I mean, virtually everything has changed, and it has. I mean, there's so many different factors in play. At the time that I published my first book, especially, that was sort of peak YA. It was the big genre everyone wanted to be writing in that space. Hunger Games was still a big deal. Like, we were right on the heels of Twilight. Adults were reading a lot of YA, and it was an exciting moment to be writing books for, you know, for teenagers. And there was a lot of room, because there was a sense that there was a lot of like opportunity and a lot of money in it. There's room for people to be writing sort of more unusual books, more grown-up books. My first book was a murder mystery that was, I mean, it's pretty mature content. Like, the very first thing that happens in the book is a sort of a violent sex scene. So, you know, you're welcome, teenagers. Since then, A couple things have happened. One is that the genre or the category is sort of contracting. There are fewer books being sold. There are fewer deals being made. I think, people are reading less of that and more of other things. And the other thing is that there has been like a little bit of an ideological capture, the same way that there has been in a lot of other industries and a lot of other areas, of this sort of push to make books, to make art more overtly political, to make the books align with progressive values. I mean, it started out in a good place. There was this push for diverse books, because the YA category was overwhelmingly white and heterosexual. It was like a lot of straight white middle class ladies writing these books, and there was an understanding that maybe we needed more and different kinds of stories in order to make the landscape richer, to have better art. And it was a great goal at first. What ended up happening, as I think often does when a movement really takes hold, is a certain contingent of people saw it as a means to kind of seize power and to self-aggrandize and to make themselves very influential. And they did that. They sort of captured the momentum of what was happening in YA and took it to this place where it's a difficult place to write now if you want to be part of the conversation, if you want to be in the community, but you don't want to be sort of like a vocal supporter of all of these very kind of trendy progressive causes. I got in trouble and this was back in 2016, I got in trouble because a bunch of authors were circulating a petition to try and cancel a book that they found problematic. And I expressed surprise and dismay that this was happening. I didn't think as artists that we should really be engaging in this kind of like attempt to silence another author's voice. And it turned out that some point in the past, I don't know, year, that had become a very unpopular view in the YA space. So yeah, it's a long-winded answer, but things are different.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I find it weird because a lot of the people who are targeting authors in YA, but also like this has been happening a lot in CanLit, which is like Canadian literature, that community. And I find it particularly odd that writers would want to cancel other writers, and also that librarians are wanting to cancel writers. Like I'm seeing librarians participate in this a lot. And I wonder why. I wonder why they don't see this as sort of like self-destructive.
Well, I mean, it's destructive to the people who don't come out on top. To the people who do, if you're an author and there's only so much cheese to go around and you get one of your competitors canceled, I guess that is, a good thing for you. And I do think that, in the YA space too, like the fact that things are more cutthroat leads to more, competitiveness taking sort of uglier forms. But so CanLit, that's
CanLit.
Isn't it
the exciting world of Canadian literature that nobody pays attention to except for other people who are also in the CanLit community?
So my understanding is that in Canada specifically, there's a lot of government support in the forms of like grants and fellowships and so on for writers. And because of that, you end up with this sort of fiercely competitive sort of a landscape where people are trying to like outwoke each other.
Yes, that's correct. A lot of these writers are funded not necessarily through talent, but through government grants, which has an impact in terms of who gets published and actually who gets media attention in Canada. But I want to talk more about this specific drama that's been going on in YA over the past few years. Why do you think that there has been so much drama specifically within the YA community? Is there something particular about young adult literature, authors, I don't know, fans?
I mean, people always want to suggest at this moment that maybe the problem is that people who write for teenagers are all kind of about as emotionally mature as teenagers, and that's the source of all of the drama.
Okay.
That's not true.
You're like, it's not. It's wrong.
The people who are doing good work in this space, and especially the ones who are keeping their heads down and writing amazing stuff. There are still a lot of authors who are just keeping their eye on the ball, and I really like that. And I think it's important, to note that even now, like the loud, crazy voices, it's not everybody. But excuse me. That said, I think that YA is really dominated by, it's really dominated by middle-aged white women who have a lot of guilt, and for whom it is like a desperate crisis to be accused of not being aligned with the cause. The worst thing that you could be accused of, for these women in their bubble is to be a Trump supporter, And so there is, you do have this group of influencers who've gotten very good at leveraging that, or had gotten very good at leveraging that, to create a maelstrom surrounding anybody who stepped out of line. And there's, there is, again, like the hyper competitiveness, everyone is trying for the same tiny scraps. It's really, really difficult in YA as everywhere else to make your living as a writer. So yeah, I think that you basically get the same dynamics that, that can dominate in other spaces where there's a sort of a cachet to being able to claim like multiple marginalized identities. Everyone wants to be very different to you. And if somebody is savvy enough to kind of leverage that to their advantage, they can really get, they can foment a lot of chaos, basically. Mm-hmm. So that is part of it. Yeah. And I don't know. I don't want to say there are some women and men in the space who clearly like to write YA because they're still sort of dwelling in like a high school headspace. That exists. It's just not the majority.
Okay. I guess so you mentioned the sort of like white middle class women, right? And who dominate as authors. Is that what you were sort of saying? So I know that you wrote, I think that this connects to an article that you wrote that I found pretty interesting. And it was called Master Cleanse for tablet. And that was, and you were talking about something you called self-help social justice, and the way that self-help social justice was particularly appealing to privileged white women. And I guess what I'm trying to connect this to is this idea that privileged white women might be particularly vulnerable to these kinds of like woke politics and cancel culture, and this desire to kind of call other people out for doing it wrong. Is that like what's primarily happening within YA, within this culture, this cancel culture thing that's happening within YA? Is it that white women who are writers are calling out other white women and trying to get them canceled on the basis that they're racist or transphobic or whatever?
I mean, to an extent, like what you see is this dynamic where there's a lot of social pressure to conform, and where there's a lot of guilt over, having like unearned privilege, having white privilege. I think that that's especially prevalent as a motivating force in spaces where women dominate. I think that you see that happen. It's not just in like YA fiction. I mean, there's been a meltdown in the online knitting community that follows the same trajectory.
I didn't know that about
Yeah,
the knitting community.
It's an observable dynamic, and it happens. You can see it happen over and over. And I think I don't really have a great theory for why men don't do this to each other, but they don't, or at least doesn't seem like it. I've asked my husband about it, like, if you're in fantasy football forum, just so somebody like, look, Kevin, you really need to check your privilege. Like, I don't think that men really do this to each other. Right. There's something about the way that women enforce like ideological conformity, enforce the orthodoxies that reign in their particular spaces, especially in spaces where a lot of women have a lot of guilt that can be kind of leveraged against them, that just allows a community to sort of tip over into this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it comes from a good place. It comes from like a noble, well-intentioned, like, I want to do good. I want to be on the right side of history. I want to be on the right side of things. It's just, you only need one or two people to take advantage of that in an ugly and destructive way for things to really get out of control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've often wondered about this too, because I find that it seems more common for women to cancel one another than, for example, men to cancel one another. If I look around I look around at my social circle, my friend groups, it's really most often, not always, but most often women who are leading the charge. And even in my personal life, if I think about friends that I've lost over politics, ideology, whatever, it's primarily been women who've determined, like, oh, I can't be friends with you because you have this opinion that I don't agree with. And I wonder, I've tried to figure out what that's about. And I sort of wonder if it has something to do with women being socialized to want to fit in more, or to be liked more, or to avoid controversy more than men.
Yeah, I was just talking about this on Megan Dom's podcast, that, I think that that's true, that women are socialized to kind of go along with things and to be people pleasers. And, that makes it more difficult to push back, especially in a space where, you'd be acting as a contrarian. The other thing is that when women are, iconoclastic, they get punished for it much more harshly than men do. You can see, like, you want to take the reaction to somebody like, I don't know, like Brett Weinstein. I can't remember which one is him. I know the other one is Harvey, so it's like you don't want to get it wrong.
I think Weinstein. Anyway, that's what I say anyway, so hopefully I'm not saying it wrong.
Yeah. And then, like, between him and Barry Weiss, who's a woman, she gets absolutely vicious, vitriolic, the most aggressively energetic pushback. There are so many people who exist just to hate her. And it's something about the contrarian, the contrarian woman that seems to really enrage people, where when it's a man, it seems like it's almost more expected. So I think that has something to do with it too.
Yeah. And I mean, unfortunately, and I always sort of want to like check my own biases when I come to these kinds of conclusions. So I don't want to say that for certain this is true, because obviously I'm coming from this as a woman and via my own experiences. But I feel like a lot of the men who would be viewed as or labeled as being part of the IWD group, that category, right? So men who are heterodox, let's say heterodox men, intellectual dark web.
Yeah.
They blew up, right? Like Jordan Peterson blew up, Brett Weinstein blew up. I feel like Dave Rubin is bigger than ever. Of course, Joe Rogan, he's blown up for more than one reason. I think he's good at what they do. I like all those men. I think that they're intelligent and interesting. I mean, to certain extents, obviously, I disagree in certain areas. But I do feel that the heterodox women tend to be marginalized. A lot of those guys have made a lot of money off of the fact that they started speaking out against cancel culture, critical race theory, the conversations around pronouns or trans politics or whatever. And I think that it's more common for women to be not only viciously attacked and threatened and silenced, but to, for their careers to struggle and to struggle financially more so than men. Like, I think that they're invisibilized and sort of pushed to the wayside in ways that men aren't when they speak out about, very similar things in very similar ways. I don't know. Have you noticed that, or like, am I just imagining this?
I just don't really know enough about it to speak to it. I was just thinking about the question of, are women less attracted to playing that kind of role because we suffer harsher social penalties for it, or do they seek it out but they can never get through to it? And like, is it the iconoclastic men pushing them out? But the thing that occurred to me too is that if you are a woman and you express sort of heterodox views, or if you say anything that doesn't align with sort of contemporary mainstream like feminist narratives, that you're often accused of, like, you're only saying this because you're trying to impress boys, which is like a whole other interesting wrinkle. It's like, men don't get dismissed on those grounds particularly, but women do.
Yeah, and I've been accused of that lately because I've started to speak out about various issues and to change my mind about certain things and to move from, most of what I did prior to a year or two ago was feminism. I've had a feminist podcast for a long time. I've run a feminist website for a long time. And at a certain point, I wanted to start exploring different issues and different ideas and, challenging my own ideologies and politics. And a lot of feminists responded by saying that I was just trying to like suck up to men to get male attention. And I just wanted to like fuck all these guys that I was interviewing. I was like, wow, that's a really feminist thing to say. What a feminist analysis is that, like, I, as an independent thinker, as somebody who wants to like think critically about various issues and not just approach everything from this like knee-jerk ideological perspective where I just apply this base feminist analysis to every single issue without really thinking it through, that must mean that I'm like desperate to get laid and I'm desperate for male attention. And the only reason I'm saying these things is for all the male attention that I'm getting.
Right.
Obviously. I don't know. So did that happen to you?
Yeah. I expressed, less than the prescribed level of excitement over the Captain Marvel movie, and was, immediately called out as what is it? They call it a pick-me.
Right. I just heard about this term like 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, I'm a little too old for that to have been like a common thing when I was growing up. I would hear more about like, the cool girl or whatever. But yeah, there's there are easier ways to get laid.
It's not that hard. Like, it's not that big of a challenge. So, I mean, I don't know if, I mean, I know, I assume that you followed this controversy around Mimi Groves that was covered in the New York Times,
Oh yeah.
which was probably like a little bit odd because it's not a very interesting story. I mean, the interesting part of the story, I suppose, is that her whole life was ruined because of something she said on Snapchat that was not particularly offensive. And as I understand it, she was quoting some lyrics from like a hip hop song.
She wasn't. She just
Oh,
said the
she
N word.
wasn't. Okay.
Yeah,
I
she just
just
she
assumed.
just said it.
And I don't say it's not controversial because I think it's okay to use the N word. I don't. I don't use the N word. And I've, when other people, white people have said the N word, I have been one of those people who's been like, you're not really allowed to say that. Like, FYI. But at the same time, it's like, to me, it seemed, first of all, weird that this kid, Jimmy, I think his name was Jimmy Galligan or something like that. Yeah, Jimmy Galligan sort of sat on this clip and saved it for an opportune time to cancel her. But also that like her whole, I mean, I can't even imagine the amount of stupid things that I said when I was a teenager and offensive things that I said when I was a teenager. Never mind, like a year ago, probably.
Yeah, I'm really so lucky that there was no monitoring device trained on me, no camera trained on me when I was growing up. I'm sure I said and did a lot of really stupid, insensitive, offensive stuff. It's unfortunate that kids now, like, all of it gets captured, all of it lives forever. What was unfortunate about this is that, like, it made both of them famous in a way that's going to follow them for the rest of their lives, and they're both like 18 years old. Is it just compounding the problem that the New York Times decided to write this story and use their full names and use their photos? I just don't know. I mean, I'm sure that, like, obviously, Mimi Groves already experienced really, really severe consequences. I mean, I think about like how devastating it would be to, have, like, because she was an athlete, she was a cheerleader, and then she was cut from the team that she basically spent her whole life working to make it onto. And that, when you're a competitive athlete and like that happens to you, that's it for your career, it's over. And so I think about that a lot. Like, that must have been devastating for her. So obviously, she's suffered a lot, and maybe being able to tell her side of the story in the New York Times was a good thing for her by comparison. On the other hand, this guy who did this, who released this video publicly in order to, get her punished for it, he did not come off well. He seemed very satisfied with what he'd done in a way that I think didn't play well, like, to normal people. And I suspect that's going to follow him around for a really long time.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess there's many problematic aspects with this kind of thing, but I mean, I feel so bad for people who are young right now. First of all, because everything is online. Like, there's a record of everything. I think maybe you tweeted Megan Dom's piece recently about that, she wrote about how grateful she was that she had grown up in private. Did you see that? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was good. And I think about that all the time because I grew up in a time when there wasn't even internet, really. I mean, there was sort of like you could dial up and, I don't know, access the library or something like that. I'm sure there were people who were on internet forums, and I just had no idea what an internet forum was. Like, it wasn't something that me and my friends participated in. So we didn't have, phones in high school. We didn't have like phone cameras on us all the time. We weren't texting one another, so there wasn't like a record of every single thing that we've ever said or argued about. We're not posting things on Instagram. We're not like publicly attacking one another. And I don't even know what these kids are going to do. Like, I think it's horrible.
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably what will happen is there'll eventually come a time, similar to the sexting panic of a few years ago. Everyone was like, your naked pictures are going to live on the internet forever. But then you reach a critical point where nobody alive doesn't have a naked picture on the internet. So it's like the great equalizer. We can all just like return to normal and stop panicking because everybody is naked somewhere on the internet. Um, so I think that maybe what will end up happening is, or at least I hope, that people will realize that everybody has dirt in their past. Everybody's done something foolish, and will stop just surveilling and keeping these awful files on each other all the time. And we'll start to reestablish some healthy boundaries, especially surrounding what people do when they're very young and very stupid, and need to be allowed to screw up and apologize and move on with their lives.
I just wanted to mention, I think there was somebody in the comments who wasn't aware of the Mimi Grove story and then got a bit lost because I didn't explain it properly. Sorry, Annie. It's like, who's Mimi Groves? So Mimi Groves, when she was, what was she, 16? How old was she when
she was 15?
15,
yeah.
Okay.
She Snapchatted a friend. She used the N-word in this 3-second video.
She said had she just gotten her license?
Her permit, yeah. Her permit, it was okay. I can drive N-words. Hard R. Everyone wants to, know that it was the hard R. It wasn't the soft A.
Okay.
And yeah, so what's interesting to me about this too is that she was embarrassed by this video. It circulated a little bit in school. Obviously, it caused enough of a kerfuffle that it made its way around. She apologized for it like 2 years before it became public. She had apologized for doing it. Then sometime in between then and her choosing a college, this guy, Jimmy Galligan, got a hold of the video and decided to hang on to it until he could release it when it would cause basically the maximum possible damage to her, which, also is not a particularly morally neutral thing to do. Probably he shouldn't have done this. It's really mean. And yeah, he released it publicly on the same day that she had made a statement on her Instagram saying support Black Lives Matter. She had, in the 3 years since she was 15 years old, had become a little bit of an activist, had become more woke. And it caused this huge controversy, huge scandal. And she was basically scapegoated. She was, kicked off the cheerleading team and expelled from college. And now she's attending community college, I think. So that's the background on that.
Do you have any idea what his motivation was for doing that?
That's an interesting question because it does seem awfully personal. And the New York Times covered it in such a way that made it seem like he was just so frustrated by all the racism in the school otherwise that wasn't being addressed and wasn't being taken care of, that he just, this was an opportunity for him to actually do something and make an impact, and that's why he did it. I kind of wonder if there might have been some other personal something, these are teenagers, they used to be friends and now they're not anymore. So maybe there was a falling out and, he wanted to harm her in that, in a more personal sense. I have no idea. I do wonder about that though, because it seems, some people have said that it's sociopathic, and I think that's going a little bit too far, but it's certainly vicious, to just sit on a compromising video of somebody and wait to release it until you can hurt them as much as possible.
Yeah, it's pretty intense. And yeah, I mean, I've been wondering about that too, because I haven't quite understood the motivation. And like you say, it does seem personal. And, there's more than one aspect to cancel culture. One aspect is, of course, that people will cancel somebody else to try to make themselves look. Your cat looks gigantic.
Sorry.
No, don't apologize.
The live stream was more informal, and so we're getting there.
Yeah, it's just casual. Bring a cat. people think that they can gain power and social clout by canceling somebody else because it'll prove that they're not racist or sexist or transphobic or whatever it is. Because if you're calling out someone else's racism, I guess that makes you non-racist. But there's also, I think, a personal factor and like maybe a jealousy factor. Like I sometimes wonder if a lot of these cancellations are just based on somebody being jealous that somebody else has a platform or mad about something. They feel slighted about something and want to get back at them.
Yeah,
What do you
or
think?
all of the above, that dynamic that you mentioned where somebody has been, gone after, somebody has tried to cancel them, and they, turn around and point the finger at somebody else, and it, ends up kind of sending it down the line. That's a real thing, and I've seen it happen in a lot of different venues, and it's unfortunately very effective. So, yeah.
Mhm. I mean, and I think, this is sort of I'm trying to figure out how to say this without getting into trouble, but I do wonder if there was some of that behind Me Too. I feel like there was a lot. I mean, the good aspect of Me Too is that it took down some really powerful predatory men. And then it sort of filtered out into the internet, and we started getting women calling out men for various reasons on Facebook, online. I was seeing it all over my feeds. And sometimes it would sound as though this guy was a predator and he had a history of abusive behavior. And sometimes it would be like, it sounds like you had a shitty experience with this guy and you're harboring some resentment and you're trying to turn it into a thing that it's not.
Mm-hmm.
And you're trying to get
Yeah.
back at him or whatever.
I mean, that's, an interesting example of a movement that started out, as so many do, in a good and useful place. But once, it was possible to kind of jump on it and attract a lot of sympathetic attention for whatever grievance you might have. I think, it was probably foolish for anybody to imagine that there wouldn't be some advantage taking there. And that certainly did happen. I mean, it presented suddenly this framework for, if a person had wronged you or hurt you, you could drag them, across the public square, and you could have thousands and thousands of people not only condemning them for having hurt you, but also kind of congratulating you on being super brave and, super strong for being willing to talk about it in public. That's very tantalizing. It's hard to pass that up.
Yeah. I know that in one of your recent podcasts that I was listening to, you and your co-host were talking about consent or consent culture, whatever you would call it. And there was, and victimization, women sort of presenting themselves as victims, and maybe I don't want to put words in your mouth, but maybe lacking accountability for their participation in certain scenarios. So one specific thing that you two discussed was a tweet, and I'm just going to read it out loud.
We always talk about tweets.
So, yeah, does anything else happen in the world? So this woman, I don't know who tweeted it, but this woman tweeted, if you have sex with someone knowing full well it's going to be a one-time thing, but the other person believes they are embarking on a relationship, I don't think you can really consider the sex consensual, although this opinion gets me into trouble at dinner parties. And I thought this was an interesting example, partly because I think that the conversation around consent has gone off the rails a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about it that I think is maybe troubling is that it's become sort of the only framework for understanding sex and for understanding relationships, so that it's like the only thing you ask anymore is, whether it was consensual. I mean, can you imagine somebody being like, you've just hooked up with a new guy and someone's like, how's the sex? And you say, it's consensual. It should be.
I consented.
Yeah, I allowed it to happen. It was consensual. I mean, and obviously that's a very limiting framework for thinking about sex, for trying to have a rewarding and healthy sex life. It also, it makes it really difficult. There's this idea that if you have like, quote, enough consent, that nobody will ever have disappointing encounters. Nobody will ever have their feelings hurt. Yeah, I think that it's, again, started out in a good place, has ended up becoming overused. People are relying on it too heavily to try and fix everything that could ever go wrong between, I mean, it's usually, heterosexual couples. The idea is that if anything goes wrong between a man and a woman, that it must have been about consent, when there are so many more different, colorful, terrible, and wonderful things that could go wrong or right between two people.
Yeah, well, and it seems to me to sort of lack understanding in terms of how relationships actually go down and how sexual encounters go down, because I cannot think of a time, for the most part, when you hook up with somebody, you don't sign a contract. It kind of just happens naturally. And so, it fails to take into account the fact that communication isn't always verbal.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of body language and more subtle cues and like facial expressions and things like that that factor into relationships and our communication with one another, sexual or not. And so I find it a bit odd that we've decided that the only way to communicate consent is, I guess, by literally saying, like, do you consent to this? Do you consent to this? Do you consent to this? And does anybody really have sexual encounters like that? Like, is that something that's actually happening in real life?
I've heard that some young men are now approaching sex in this way. I have been married for a really long time, so I've not experienced that. Kind of glad that I haven't. It sounds like not a particularly enjoyable way to, to experience intimacy. Sounds distracting, and I think that it can create a lot of anxiety surrounding the act. People don't feel that they can trust themselves. They don't feel they can trust each other. And you're not going to have a good time if you are feeling already that suspicious of your partner. It makes things very, very fraught. The other thing too is that at this point, the baseline for women, at least, is they're frequently told it's not just consent, it's, quote, enthusiastic consent, which basically, can be read at this point as if your enthusiasm flags at any point during the encounter, if you ever feel a little confused or a little unsure or a little uncomfortable, it means that consent wasn't there. There wasn't enough consent. And that's to basically tell women that they're one uncomfortable moment away from being assaulted, and to tell men that if at any point their partner's enthusiasm wanes during the encounter, then they're a heartbeat away from committing assault all the time. I think that it makes it very difficult for people to have healthy relationships with each other. That's just such a heavy thing to pile on everybody.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and so what was your take as far as this tweet was concerned? I mean, do you think that's sort of legitimate at all, that if one person is just wanting, and I guess assuming, one person just wants a one night stand, the other person wants a relationship, is that problematic?
Well, so the thing about this tweet that I I find fascinating, I spent a lot of time thinking about it, is that it says specifically, if you know full well that it's a one-time thing, and the other person, and you know the other person is expecting a relationship, that the sex is not consensual. And I think that this is a real convoluted scenario to begin with. I mean, this is basically the plot of the movie Cruel Intentions. I cannot think of it happening in any other real life scenario where somebody's like, unless somebody's intentionally deceiving their partner, saying, you know, that, like, allowing them to believe that it's a relationship when it's really just a one-time thing, which is of course wrong for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with consent. Then ultimately, you know, I think that what's more likely is you get cases where people get their wires crossed. And, you know, sure, it's not good to deceive somebody into believing that you want a relationship in order to sleep with them. It's also not good to deceive somebody into thinking that you're okay with casual sex when what you're really hoping to do is transform it into a relationship. So it kind of goes both ways.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I thought when I heard about this was that most people at the beginning don't really know what they want. You know, like, I think that it's, you know, I would think that it was wrong to give someone the impression you wanted a relationship with them when you knew that you didn't. And yeah, and I do think that it's sort of wrong. I mean, it's just a recipe to get hurt, really, more so than it being wrong. If you're pretending that you just want casual sex when what you want is a relationship. But I think that mostly what actually happens is that people don't really know, because they're kind of just getting to know each other and they're just starting to see each other. So they're hooking up and they don't know if they want a relationship with one another because they don't know each other that well yet.
Yeah. I mean, this is the hazard, obviously, of casual sex. And, you know, it's why, if you definitely want to be safe from that kind of disappointment or from, you know, that kind of miscommunication, it may be the best thing not to sleep with people that you don't know very well, that you haven't already had, you know, a sort of a conversation to establish the framework of the relationship with, which is, you know, an unpopular thing to say, because people will take it as like, oh, you know, why are you down on casual sex? And, you know, I'm not at all. I just think that it's not necessarily for everyone. You know, some people don't have the emotional bandwidth to actually enjoy it. It's not really what they want, and that's also fine.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, there's, on one hand, it's like, I'm not opposed to casual sex by any means. I think that casual sex can be fun. I also think that in general, casual sex is not super satisfying for women. I think that it's easier for men to come out of casual sex type situations feeling literally satisfied as opposed to
You could have just stopped and you were like, it's easier for men to come, and I was like, yes, that's it. That's, you know, that's the thing.
Yeah, it's easier for men to come, and it's easier for men to come with people that they don't know. Like, it doesn't really
Yes.
take much at all. But for women, it's harder to come when you're with a stranger.
This is true. This is why, you know, it's like, if you're going to do something casual, it's better to do something casual with somebody who you are doing it with repeatedly. Unfortunately, it's very unfair that it works this way.
It is unfair. And somebody that you sort of know and trust, I would argue. But I guess I think that there's this, I mean, I wouldn't, I sort of have started to say to women, like, casual sex isn't great, don't bother doing it. But I also, you know, like, I was young and had lots of casual sex, and, you know, it wasn't necessarily terrible. Sometimes it was terrible, but mostly it was just boring. You know, it wasn't so much that I was like traumatized by those situations. It's just that at a certain point I was like, this is not like doing it for me at all, and it's more enjoyable to have sex with people that you're in relationships with or people that you know. And then of course, if you are concerned about those kinds of scenarios, like you said, where, you know, one person doesn't want a relationship and the other one does, then you really shouldn't be having casual sex, and you should sort of be, it sounds so prudish to say, but you should sort of be waiting until you've gone on at least a few dates with this person and you feel comfortable enough to communicate to them about those things, because it is unlikely that you're going to feel comfortable enough to communicate about those kinds of things on the first or second date, especially when you're young, right? I mean, the other thing is that when you're young, you sort of don't really know how to have those conversations, I think.
Yeah. I think the thing is that, that's part of it is taking, sort of knowing yourself well enough to know whether you're going to get out of a casual encounter what it is that you're actually looking for. The other thing is that, and this is a point that I hammer a lot, we don't really equip women to handle the outcome of their choices when their choices make them unhappy. It's, I think, a little bit of a failure of feminism that we stopped just short of making this happen. That, we were very big on, like, women have agency, women can, that women shouldn't be punished for having casual sex, they shouldn't be slut shamed. We're very big on women making their choices and feeling empowered by them and being happy with the choices they've made. Unfortunately, when you have agency, you also have the power to make choices that may not actually go the way you want them to. And that's, part of the responsibility that comes with being, like, a fully autonomous human being. But we're less comfortable as a society with the idea of a woman making her own choices and then coming to feel really, really bad about them. We don't really encourage women to sit with the discomfort of having done something regretted, because we're not comfortable with that idea. Like, society wide, it makes us nervous to think of a woman doing something and then feeling shamed about it. So, it's a horrible emotion to feel, and it's not easy. But I think that, encouraging women to be able to handle that experience, to wake up in the morning, or to look back on something a week or a month from when it happened and say, I really wish I hadn't done that. Something that every person needs to be able to do and needs to be able to, to do capably.
I mean, I think that there's, again, it's a complicated situation, because I think that, again, there's this thing where women are kind of taught to be nice and polite and to not make people feel uncomfortable and not to offend anybody. And so, of course, that, factors into the bedroom. Girls will, again, especially when you're younger, you kind of go along with things that maybe you don't want to go along with, or maybe you look back and think, like, why did I do that? I don't really want to do that. And it's partly to do with being young and the fact that you're still learning and getting to know yourself, and probably partly to do with the fact that you're trying to fit in. And a lot of boys and men are going to be more sexually aggressive at that age. I'm just trying to, there's some people in the live chat who are getting pissed off because they're like, I don't want it to seem as though we're pretending that sexual assault doesn't happen regularly and that rape doesn't happen and that there are men who are predatorial, and that, that I didn't experience things where I was young, where I left the situation being like, oh, I was really pressured into doing something that I didn't want to do, and now I feel gross about it. And on one hand, I think it's useful for us to learn how to be accountable for the choices that we make and to not always blame other people. And on the other hand, I mean, we also have to hold men accountable who push women to do things they don't want to do, or pressure them, or take advantage of situations where girls are vulnerable, like they're wasted, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, I don't know. It's a tough thing where, oftentimes the counterpoint to having a conversation like this is people saying, well, we need to teach men not to rape. And I think that, yes, obviously we need to encourage men to be respectful. We need to encourage them to not pressure women. There's this sort of mode of, like, go after what you want and keep asking until the answer is yes, that guys can be taught is like the way to get what they want, or the way to, it goes hand in hand with the idea that women say no when they really mean yes, or they say no when they mean convince me. We need to get away from that. That's, it's not true and it's not healthy. I do think that ultimately you reach a point where, a certain number of men are not going to be like the ones who are determined to commit crimes, are going to commit crimes even though they know they're wrong. And, then it becomes a question of like, how can women protect themselves? There was an interesting body of research that taught women to, in college, to be more assertive, like they learned techniques. And it wasn't victim blaming. It wasn't like, don't drink or anything, along those lines. It was basically just teaching them to identify when like pressure was coming to bear on a situation, and to say, no, I'm leaving, or, no, you can't come in my room, or whatever. And it turned out that it was really effective. There was I wish that I could remember the exact title of this New York Magazine article about it, but it was maybe 4 years ago that it was written up, and it was encouraging, to see that it's not entirely just about like every woman being a sort of a hapless victim in waiting. There are things you can do to make it less likely that you'll end up in a position where you're going to be pressured.
Yeah. And I wonder if I was thinking about this in terms of the conversation around how we deal with shame or regret, and the accountability aspect of that. So, we ended up in a situation we feel bad about the next day, and then instead of looking at how that situation went down or how we ended up there, or even thinking about why we didn't like that situation, like those kinds of situations can be learning processes also. And again, I'm not talking about a situation where someone is sexually assaulted, for those who might be feeling triggered by this. I mean, like you did something, you did consent to it, and then later you feel gross about it, or you wish you hadn't, or in retrospect you think, actually I didn't like that, actually I didn't want to do that, why did I do that? And I wonder if there's sort of a culture of wanting to blame someone else rather than looking at what we could have done ourselves in that situation, and looking at why we didn't like that, and thinking about what we could do next time so that we don't end up participating in something that makes us feel bad or regretful or ashamed later.
Yeah, it's a natural human impulse to try to avoid feeling ashamed. It's a really, really uncomfortable emotion to feel. And, I think it's easy, not ultimately like particularly educational or particularly resilience building, but easy to look for somebody else whose fault it can be. There's nothing worse to feel than ashamed of yourself. I just see somebody in the comments mentioned Aziz Ansari, who I feel like that story follows me onto every podcast I ever do. Somebody ends up bringing him up.
Did you write about that situation? Is that why?
I didn't, but it's just such an example, I think, of like a sort of a MeToo gray area where a lot of people were, uncomfortable with how that accusation played out. And, other people felt that it was really righteous. And so there was like a lot of disagreement on how valid it was, or how appropriate it was that things played out the way they did.
Sorry, I interrupted you. I don't know if you were going somewhere with.
No, I don't remember what I was about to say.
The shame. Sorry, that was my
fault. There was the shame, and then there was the cat. Like
it feels bad to feel ashamed. Nobody likes to feel ashamed, so we sort of react by, I don't know, blaming something external, blaming somebody else, or trying to. I feel like sometimes what we do is we try to justify the shame. Like we try to make ourselves feel better about it. And it's like, oh, well, maybe I should embrace that as like a sex positive experience and like a you go girl kind of thing.
Yeah, there, I mean, that's the flip side of it. And you know, it doesn't have to be either. You can just say like, you know, I really feel shitty that that I made this choice and I wish that I hadn't. And, you know, the thing that I often, in my old life as a teen advice columnist, I tried to encourage young women, especially, to understand that regret can be a useful emotion. It teaches you something about what you don't want, what you do want, what you can handle, what you can't. And that, sometimes you feel bad because you've been wronged. But there's not always a villain in the equation, that sometimes a person can hurt you, but it doesn't mean that you were wronged, you were just hurt. People hurt each other. It happens all the time.
Right. Right. I think that's a good point. And I can't blame young women for doing this kind of thing entirely, because I feel like when I was younger, I participated in this also where, like I would feel hurt or slighted or disrespected and angry about it. And so I think I wanted to turn it into a villain victim situation when it wasn't, where, I would be the victim, he would be the villain. And, like, I'm not saying men don't do bad things to women in relationships or don't behave badly or whatever, but it can't always be so black and white. And I think that it doesn't necessarily help to just try to vilify the other person and sort of dehumanize them in that way.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll let you go soon. Sorry, it's been like an hour and a half. So we got to go soon, you guys. So if you have a question, ask it now. There was a question in there that I think I missed from Wesley. What did he say? Is culture hurting young women by presenting woke female heroes who are not good role models or shallow compared to non-woke female heroes? I'm not totally sure I understand what that means. Is culture hurting young women by presenting woke female heroes who are not good role models or shallow? I don't know who a woke female hero would be.
So yeah, I'm trying to think.
Okay. I mean, Wesley, if you want to expand on that, go ahead. But otherwise, I'm not sure how we can answer that because I don't totally understand. There was somebody who asked if you, they said, would Kat consider herself a member of a new generation of the intellectual dark web, a cooler, less self-righteous version of the original intellectual dark web, along with Katie Herzog, Jesse Singal, and Coleman Hughes, etc.?
I mean, that sounds like a very elegant club to be in. I would, those are three people whose work I admire very much. I would be very pleased to be considered a member of any club that they are also members of. Okay. Do I consider myself part of a new generation? I don't know. I mean, I guess all of the, the intellectual dark web are like sort of Gen Xers, right? So that, that group would be the millennial cohort. But the whole concept of the intellectual dark web got so silly and fell apart so fast that, I think that there is a hazard to trying to place people who are, the thing they have most in common is basically that they're not joiners, to try to put them into a sort of a tribe of their own, like the tribe of the tribeless. I get the impulse, but I'm not sure that it ends up working out that well.
Yeah, okay. Fair answer. Good answer. Somebody in the comments also says, I'm surprised by how many young women don't communicate their wants and needs during sex. This is obviously about what we were talking about earlier. I think shame and guilt is a big part of the aftermath of so sex. I think that's a good point. I think that a lot of it, maybe comes from girls or young women not really knowing how to communicate openly.
So this was the thing, back when yes means yes became sort of like the new, we decided no means no was not good enough. And we had to have yes means yes as the criteria for like what a consensual or a good encounter consisted of. I was really excited about this because I thought that it was going to mean that women were encouraged to think about what they wanted, in these relationships, not to just be seen as like gatekeepers, sort of passively consenting to whatever the man wanted to do, but, to think in terms of like, what do I want? What do I like? And to articulate it, which is a huge thing. Being assertive isn't just about saying no when you don't want to. It's about saying, this is what I want. Let's do this. And, before it turned out that yes means yes meant something very different and not especially good. It was just like no means no on steroids. I was really excited about this idea that women were going to be, encouraged to be proactive, to be sort of the architects of their own desires in this way and in their relationships. And I still think that would be a great thing.
Yeah. Someone says, yes, it's irritating the fact that so many women do not communicate what they want. Much of this is rooted in shame and social conditioning, but still, I don't understand how they can be this way for decades. I mean, it is interesting because I feel like that's sort of something that third wave feminism should have dealt with and has clearly failed to.
Yeah, I
don't know. Okay, I'm going to let you go. There's one final question. It's a big question. What are your predictions for 2021 in terms of cancel culture? Are we getting worse? Are we getting better? Where is it going to go? What's going to happen?
Before being dad, I was feeling pretty good about 2021, and now I just think that it's not going to get any better. It's going to get worse first. There's going to be another being dad or 5 before we see our way out of this dark place that we're in.
Yeah, so dads, teach your daughters how to use can openers.
Or if you don't, for the love of God, don't post about it on Twitter.
No, that was such a long thread just about his daughter and the can opener. It really was unnecessary for him to share it on Twitter at all. Never mind at length. Okay, well, thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. It was really great to talk to you.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Let people know where they can find your work.
Oh, I'm on Twitter at Kat Rosenfield. It's just my name. And I post links to pretty much everything I write there. So if you want to find everything in one place, that's a good place to go.
Okay. And I realized I forgot to mention earlier that you co-host Feminine Chaos. That's the name of your podcast, right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Thank you again. Thanks everyone for coming. Bye, you guys.